Bruges Group. So, two things. What do you make of the court ruling, and what do you make of those who question the impartiality of the Supreme Court judges?
Originally, when this case was brought, I didn't feel that that Gina Miller and her colleagues were right, because I thought that it wasn't really for the courts to interfere with parliamentary process, parliamentary procedure. There's been no precedent for that over the years. Now, the Supreme Court found that I was wrong. Now, you have a choice in this situation. You either accept the verdict or the ruling of a court, or you don't. And to me, you can argue the toss with a lower court, and I don't believe that we should have a country where you're not able to criticise the courts. I was actually involved in a case a few years ago where Peter Hain had criticised the Northern Ireland High Courts, and he wrote that in his autobiography, which I published. And we were taken to court by the Attorney General of Northern Ireland for criticising a judge. Can you believe? This was a law that hadn't been invoked since 1908. Now, in the end, the Attorney General had to back down because it was clearly preposterous. So I'm not somebody who thinks that you can't criticise a court. What I think you shouldn't do is criticise the motivation of Supreme Court judges. They operate the highest court in the land. And the reason I have disagreed with many people on my side of the Brexit argument for their views on the Supreme Court is they seem to be implying that the Supreme Court is politically motivated. Now, I don't believe that for a second. I don't believe the judiciary is politically motivated. Just as if I interview a politician during a general election on my radio show, just as I leave my political opinions at the door of the radio studio, Supreme Court judges leave their political opinions at the door of the court. Now, this verdict was 11-0. Now, I doubt very much whether every single Supreme Court judge voted Remain. And even if they did, I doubt whether they were such ardent Remainers that they would risk their entire judicial reputation to make this kind of decision. Anyone who's read the judgment, anyone who's listened to Baroness Hale when she read it out in court, can surely understand the reasons that they did so. Now, fine, if you disagree with the reasons, I have no problem with people going through those reasons and explaining why. But I do have a problem with people who seem to think that it's perfectly okay to impugn the reputations of the judges themselves. And that's what's been happening over the last couple of days, and I think it's wrong.
So there's been an issue in this country. Brexit didn't cause this, but debate has become more heated. You were on Question Time in that infamous moment where you were trying to interject, and Fiona Bruce, I think, said this is not your show. What do you think your experience in Question Time says about the state of debate in the UK?
I was on Question Time last year for the first time, and I really enjoyed it. It was a panel of 5. It's chaired by David Dimbleby. It's a really good audience in Chesterfield. And as it was my first time doing it, I was quite nervous because going on Question Time, there's a tremendous opportunity to make a complete dick of yourself. But I really, really enjoyed it. Now, this time, it was different. It was a live programme from Westminster. I just spent 3 hours on my radio show. So I was the last panellist to arrive. I only arrived 5 minutes before it started. So I didn't have any of the normal sort of banter with the other panellists before the show. I knew them all a bit anyway. I'd interviewed them on my show. And I expected to enjoy it. But I didn't. I hated every single minute of it. It was the worst experience I've had on television in 20 years. And it was for many reasons. And it was partly because there were 6 people. I mean, how can you have a rational debate in an hour with 6 people? I mean, just divide the minutes up. And then you've got Fiona Bruce, who speaks quite a lot, much more than David Dimbleby did. Now, I'm not going to criticise Fiona Bruce for the way that she chaired it, but she didn't really have control over the programme right from the word go. And she allowed particularly Emily Thornberry, Ian Blackford and Kwasi Kwarteng just to talk over each other. And it was more or less impossible for Layla Moran and myself to get a word in edgeways. Now I suffer from the fact that I've got quite a soft voice, so it's in those situations it's quite difficult to intervene. And if you try and intervene too much, you come across very badly to the audience as well. So I just decided to sit back and just let them get on with it, because I knew what people at home would be thinking, and that proved to be right. Now, the incident you mentioned about the guy in the audience, and he was essentially saying that Leavers didn't know what they voted for, they were all a bit thick, and all the rest of it. I tried, once he had finished his point, or was getting to finish his point, I wanted to ask him, well, did you, as a Remainer, know exactly what you were voting for? Did you realise that that France and Germany and other countries wanted a European army, etc., etc.? And I tried to interject on him a couple of times, and Fiona Bruce stopped me from doing that. Now, to my mind, that show is partly about interaction between the panellists and the audience. Now, she is the host; she had every right to shut me down, but I did find that quite frustrating because I really hadn't had an opportunity to speak very much up until that point anyway. And then, of course, later in the programme, I started to give an answer. And Ian Blackford, the Westminster leader of the SNP, sitting to my right, after I'd uttered 5 words, tried to interrupt me. So I gave him a death stare. And then he did it again. And that was when I slightly lost it, and I just look, what is the point of trying to debate with you if all you're going to do is try and interrupt and shut me down? Well, I've hardly uttered a word. And it was at that point that it flitted through my mind, well, what's the point of doing this? Shall I just walk out? Now, I'm glad I didn't do that, because I think to people on the right, I would have probably been a bit of a hero. But I think to most other people, they would have seen me as, they would have seen it as just being gratuitous. So I'm glad I didn't do it. But then, of course, he interrupted me a third time. And it was at that point Fiona Bruce did intervene and say, look, come on. And then he got to the end of the programme where she went around all the other panellists to answer the final question and then completely missed me out. So she said, oh, time's up. And I said, so I don't get to answer this question, do I? She said, oh, sorry, you got 10 seconds. So it was a very dispiriting experience in all sorts of ways, because I thought the standard of debate in that show was just awful. And I think one of the things that, and Fiona, to be fair to her, didn't have a chance to do this because I arrived comparatively late. I think, and I have this experience on my own show, if as the host you set the ground rules at the beginning of a debate, things tend to go okay. I present a similar show to Question Time Cross Question, where admittedly we've only got 4 panellists, but at the beginning of the show I explain to them what I want out of the show, the kind of atmosphere I want. I say I don't want argy-bargy, this is a much more thoughtful show than other panel shows, and generally they respect that. And I think that's what she should do before every Question Time, and make clear that she is in charge and she won't tolerate the kind of abuse of the programme that we saw on that particular edition.
So it's fascinating. I think that both sides are equally convinced, it seems, that the other is a threat to democracy. Why do you think that is, that both sides are equally convinced that the other side is a threat? And do you think one side or both sides have any merit in saying that?
I think we've got to a point in our political discourse where people live in their own silos, their own echo chambers. For example, Brexiteers say they won't ever listen to James O'Brien on LBC because of his views on Brexit. You'll get Remainers saying that they won't listen to Nick Ferrari or Nigel Farage for the same reason. And we are moving towards an American style of discourse where if you're on the right, you watch Fox News. If you're on the left, you watch CNN. I mean, to my mind, both are wrong. You shouldn't live in your own echo chamber. I always say on my radio show, I prefer to hear from people who disagree with me, because I want to be challenged. I want my views challenged, because sometimes you never know, I might change them. And that has happened on many occasions. I start off with one view at the beginning of an hour and several callers convince me I'm wrong. And at the end of the hour, I come to a different conclusion. Now, some people say, well, that shows you're a weak character. You just agree with the last person that speaks to you. Well, that's not true. And this doesn't happen that often, but it has happened. And I think people have just got to be more open to accept that other people have a different view from themselves, that those views are perfectly legitimate, and they think they're right just as much as you think you're right. And until we get back to a situation where we respect the fact that someone else can have a point of view, a different point of view, I really fear for what's happening. I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Slightly wishy-washy title. But it is all about what we're talking about here, the decline in standards in public discourse. And I'm not going to pretend I've got a huge amount of solutions. I mean, maybe when I've only written 10,000 words so far, but maybe when I get further on, I'm going to try and think about, well, how can we change this sort of attitude that people have now? Because if we don't have a rational debate on rational debates, I really fear as to where we're going to end up in say 5 or 10 years' time.
So one word that comes up a lot is things like dictator. Nicola Sturgeon said it when I was interviewing Robert Olds. He said people were hysterical who said that, and then he said the word himself. He said Remainers are acting like dictators. Do you think that type of language is fair? And do you think when I interviewed MP Chris Stevens, he said Boris Johnson is a threat to democracy? Do you think criticism like that is fair?
Not particularly. I think. I mean, I've just been looking at Twitter this morning, which is obviously not a very good thing to do in these situations. I mean, we're talking the day after Parliament came back from the non-prorogation, and the standard of debate last night, I mean, was appalling. And on both sides, you had MPs literally screaming at each other. You had the Labour MP for Dewsbury, Paula Sherriff, making an impassioned plea to Boris Johnson to moderate his language. Yet you look at the way that she was conducting herself, her face was contorted with hatred. Barry Shearman, the same. And yet these people were having a go at Boris Johnson for his language. And I think, in a sense, quite rightly so, because I do think he's should have been more careful in some of the words he's used. And for his response to Paula Sherriff to be accusing her of humbug. Now, I mean, humbug is not exactly the worst word that you can use if you want to be pejorative. But, I mean, in the circumstances, it was completely inappropriate. But then there are other MPs who are just gratuitous in their admonition of others for using language that they shouldn't. Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, yesterday used the phrase, well, it's a bit like, when do you stop beating your wife, which is a well-known phrase. We all know it doesn't mean advocating domestic violence and all the rest of it. But she got up and, on a point of order, asked the Speaker whether that was appropriate. And then, of course, a couple of hours later, it's revealed on a tweet that she used exactly that phrase herself. And that's when people think, well, hang on a minute, these people are just hypocrites. They're just using the situation for political advantage. But I don't believe that Boris Johnson is a dictator. I mean, Boris Johnson, actually, take Brexit out of the equation, and you look at Boris Johnson's views on most issues, most social issues, and he's actually very, very liberal. He was one of the first Tory MPs to promote gay marriage, for example. He was on immigration. He wanted an amnesty for illegal immigrants when he was Mayor of London. He told me at the Tory hustings that he wanted to implement that as Prime Minister. Those aren't the policies of a dictator. It's a bit like people use the word fascist nowadays to anyone that disagrees with them, and without having the remotest clue what the word fascist actually means. And that's where, again, people need to be careful about what they say. Neil Coyle, the Labour MP for Bermondsey, he's had a right old go at Piers Morgan this morning, told him to fuck off and just use language totally inappropriate for an MP. Now, Neil Coyle is a moderate kind of guy, and yet he's being triggered to sink to the same level as the people that he's criticising. And I'll plead guilty to having done it myself in the past. But I now, if somebody calls me a twat on Twitter, my natural temptation is to call them a fucking twat back. I mean, look, it's a human thing to do. We are conditioned to react adversely if somebody uses that kind of language to us. And I would have done that a year ago. I don't do it anymore. I deliberately don't do it. No matter what the provocation is, I don't do it anymore. The worst I'll you'll laugh now. The worst word I use is muppet, which somehow is somehow more wounding than calling someone a twat. But I just think that, and I've got to the point where if I didn't do the job that I do, I wouldn't be on Twitter anymore. It's become an absolute sewer. And I have to admit that if somebody has a go at me, and then I sometimes retweet abuse just to make the person realise that they've just gone over the top. But what I've also come to realise that if I do that, when I've got 160,000 followers on Twitter now, that if I do that, there will be a little army of my followers that then descend on that person and rip them apart. Now, if you're involved in the political game, you can probably cope with that. But if you're Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, Scunthorpe, and you've made a bit of an off-colour remark, but actually you're a nice little old lady who's sort of just not used to this sort of thing, I mean, that can be really, really disturbing. So I now also have to think, well, even if I do that, what the consequences are for the other person. So Twitter, I think, is unfortunately becoming almost unusable for some people, and I have no doubt that the moment I stop doing my LBC show, the moment I stop doing political punditry, I won't delete my Twitter account, but I will probably just use it to look at what other people say. I doubt whether I will engage much myself.
I went to the protests against prorogation when it was announced. Some of the views I heard there were things like, oh, well, the referendum wasn't legally binding, just revoke it. Lib Dems voted to just revoke the referendum. And then on the flip side, I think it was 52% want Boris Johnson to break the law to get Brexit. And when I was interviewing Catherine Blake-Locke and Robert Olds, they think even if he breaks parliamentary law by coming out with a no deal, that's fine because the country voted for Brexit. Do you think each side is as bad as each other?
Well, we've just had an example of the Supreme Court saying that the Prime Minister of this country acted unlawfully. Anyone who thinks that he should do that again, particularly within a few weeks of being found guilty of doing it the first time, is delusional. And they are the ones that are a threat to democracy. Now, I think from the legal advice that some people have told me they've seen, there are loopholes in the Hillary Benn Oliver Letwin Act. Now, if there are, then maybe there is a way around that for Boris Johnson. But to deliberately flout the law as Prime Minister, what message does that send to somebody who's thinking of fiddling their benefits? What message does that send to a drug dealer? I mean, it basically says, well, I'm the Prime Minister, I've broken the law. So, I mean, feel free, go right ahead and you break the law yourself and don't fear the consequences. I think that's an unsustainable position. I think anybody that promotes that position is really acting very irresponsibly. And those people that you've mentioned, I mean, they have admittedly a minor public profile, but they should be ashamed of themselves, I think. I want Britain to leave the EU on the 31st of October. And I don't object if there are parliamentary ways of getting around it. That's fair game. I mean, bear in mind the Remainers have used all sorts of parliamentary chicanery over the past couple of years to get their way. So I don't mind if the Prime Minister gets down and dirty a little bit and mixes it with them. But you cannot act unlawfully. You cannot deliberately flout the law. That's where I really draw the line.
Iain Dale, thank you very much.
Cheers.